they typically get somewhere between 12 and 15 parts per million sulfur on something that's never been anywhere near any sulfur. And that's purely, I would suggest, maybe yeast generated. So the idea that a cider is sulfur-free is just not possible in my mind. Every cider's got sulfur in it. It's just maybe come from a different place.
Hello, my name is Ria Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
You just heard Tom Oliver of Oliver Cider and Perry, based in Herefordshire, England, bringing us into this here episode 361, and he was speaking on the topic of sulfur dioxide, which is an element that is found in cider and also wine, and it is a hot topic item because a lot of folks, including myself, has felt like, wow, does sulfur or sulfites impact me when I'm drinking? So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is in the process of cider making, when to add SO2. And the title of the panel discussion was, is SO2 necessary? So you're going to hear a wide range of thoughts on this, which I think is really delightful. Again, a great panel. And from my perspective as an amateur cider maker, I've been dealing with that question since I started making cider. Now I have kind of come to terms with that, but I'm going to hold my thoughts on that for now and allow the panel to just roll out as it is. So that discussion will be coming up shortly, but first, a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. We have a little bit of news from the northern border up in Canada. I got an email from Matt, and he wrote, "Hi, Ria. I've worked my way through most of your podcast episodes while walking my dog." So, Matt, I'm figuring you must have walked a lot because you can now listen nonstop to Cider Chat for like 14 days in a row, something crazy like that. So, good for you for getting the exercise and tuning into Cider Chat. Thank you for that. He continues with, "I also have been building out a cider orchard at the southern end of the Georgian Triangle near the hamlet of Lavender, Ontario." Now, the Georgian Triangle, for those of you who don't know, is, imagine the map of Canada, right? And you see Toronto and go, I believe it's west, just west of Toronto, a little maybe northwest, major apple region, some very good cideries up there. He writes that, "I thought you'd like to, hear about this release." He didn't send me any cider, so I guess I'm hearing about this release since there is a quince cider. He writes that he's from Toronto, and Revel Cider, which is in Gulf, and is one of the best cideries around. Lots of solid ciders alongside innovative combos and some wines as well. What was really cool about this, Matt, and you sending this to me, and I really was stoked because they have at Revel what is called the Carbonic Edition. And they have a 6-pack of 3 never-before-seen ciders made via carbonic maceration. And I have done this. I haven't done this for a long time, but I happen to have a bunch of empty kegs, stainless steel kegs, and maybe this is something to do, a pretty cool idea to do with quince, actually, because it looks like they're doing this with 100% quince. And if you don't know what carbonic maceration is, it's where you ferment the fruit whole. And I've done this with wine. So it was with grapes, went out and foraged a whole bunch of Concord grapes out in the backyard, try to get all the little stems off because you don't want to have something tasting like what we call stem wine, right? You want to have the fruit there. Didn't take out the seeds, didn't worry about that, didn't mush it up, just stuffed a little 5-gallon corny keg full of all these grapes, and I believe, I'd have to look at my notes, but I believe we added some yeast and just, covered it with some CO2, filled that vessel up, and just let it ferment on its own. And truthfully, when that wine that I made first came out in the bottle, it was kind of harsh. I couldn't deal with it. But I would say that's true for a lot of my ciders. Right away, I find that they taste one way, and then I let it age for a year or so, and then it was just like, boom, such a complex drink. And this is what they are doing at Revel. So they have Quince, a Kingston Black, and also a Chisel Jersey. So I'll have the links in the show notes to Revel Cider. But you could just look it up, Revel, that's REVEL cider.com. And I did go onto the site to see, well, is it possible to order this? And they do not ship to us down here in the southern hemisphere of North America, called the US of A. But to other locations, yes. It's just one of those dag-nabbit things. Anyways, I really appreciate you letting me know about this, Matt. I want to get up to the Georgian Triangle. I'd love to sit down and drink some of these ciders with you. But in the meanwhile, bravo for doing this. It sounds like it's going well there, and do keep me posted. And for anyone out there in Ciderville, consider about doing this. Like, if you have some little old corny kegs, and I think I'm going to be having a big tag sale of corny kegs. I have a ton that I'm going to be moving along on that first weekend of November. So stay tuned for that, because I'm going to be selling some stuff. I have so much, and I got to kind of move it along. That's another story. If you're in my special spot of Ciderville, get a hold of me now. And maybe I could hook you up with one of those little cakes to prepare early for cider making next fall. Anywho, I love getting these little emails. Keep on sending them this way to info@ciderchat.com, and I'll be able to reply to them as I can. But I just love that idea. Carbonic maceration, yet another technique that was used in winemaking and that we're seeing being used by cider makers. Very, very cool. And wow, the complexity of that is quite unique. Cider Chat is listener-supported podcasting, meaning you out there in Ciderville are the folks that help keep this podcast on the air by hitting the donate button at ciderchat.com or becoming a patron at the Cider Chat Patreon page, which is spelled Patreon. You could Google it at Cider Chat Patreon. Another way that this podcast is able to keep on rolling out is that there are occasionally sponsors, and one of them is Fermentus. So let me return next to a little bit of a chit-chat about their premier SAF cider yeast just for you. Sweet, crisp, fresh, or balanced, whatever the cider you want to make, you will find the right yeast for your favorite cider in the SAF cider range by Fermentus. This week, let's discover SAF cider AC4. AC4 stands for Apple Crisp. This yeast is ideal to produce fresh and crisp cider. It ensures a very good assimilation of fructose and is excellent for low-gravity ciders. The results are an intensely fresh aromatic profile, meaning apple and floral, with a crisp mouthfeel, enhancing cider structure. SAF Cider AC4 is the perfect fit for highly fresh and crisp, sweet, and dry ciders. Want to explore diversity of cider profiles? Discover it all through the selection of yeast strains by visiting their website, fermentus.com. Up next is our featured presentation, a panel recording from CiderCon 2023. CiderCon is an annual conference hosted by the American Cider Association. You can find out more about the ACA by going to ciderassociation.org. Now, this panel took place on Thursday afternoon, I believe it was, and once again introduced some of the members, but they're going to be telling you a little bit more about them. The moderator, however, did not speak much about himself, and you're going to hear from Tim shortly. He did a really outstanding job moderating, and his full name is Tim Godfrey, and he has a consulting firm called Godfrey Beverage Solutions. And then we'll be going straight away to Dave Takish of Two Town Cider based in Oregon. Then you'll be hearing from Tegan Beam of Lost Boy Cider based in Virginia. And then Tom Oliver of Oliver Cider and Perry Company in Herefordshire in the UK. So without further ado, this is a very good time to remind you to grab a glass and join this chat as we roll to CiderCon 2023 and the panel discussion titled, Is SO2 Necessary?
The goal here is really to explore SO2, something that I think a lot of us have a pretty dogmatic approach to using. It's relatively ubiquitous in winemaking and the cider making, so we're going to explore the properties of why it's come to the place it is, and these fine folks to my left are going to explain how they use it, if they use it, and how they go about using it. So let's get some intros first. Dave, why don't you tell everyone who you are?
Sweet. Well, my name is Dave Takish. I'm the head cider maker and one of the co-owners at Two Town Cider House. We've been around for 12 years now, and we started in 2010. And my background is that I got into fermentation early on and went to school for fermentation science at Oregon State University. I was very much in the beer side of things back then. Craft beer was my jam. Worked in the brew industry for a little bit. Had the opportunity to go to grad school studying Pinot Noir wine, which is big in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, where I'm from. From there, went into the wine industry, working at both large and small operations in the Pacific Northwest, and then hooked up with some homebrew buddies from college to start a crazy harebrained idea, which was hard cider. It's been a wild ride ever since.
My name is Tegan Bion. I am currently the cider maker at Lost Boy Cider in Alexandria, Virginia. That's kind of the DC area for those who aren't that familiar with the state. I have kind of a storied history with cider. I started out making cider at home, as many folks do. I then started working in tasting rooms. From there, I also worked at a winery initially, although mine was in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. After that, I moved up to Vermont and worked at Eden Specialty Ciders. If you're familiar with them, they make some of the best ice cider in the world, as well as a bunch of really great apple-centric dry ciders. That was a great experience. From there, I then moved to Sweden, and I worked at Brännlund Cider in Umeå, northern Sweden, for a couple years as their assistant cider maker. And from there, I returned back to the U.S. to do Lost Boy. So a bunch of different places all have different philosophies, and I'll be happy to share with you my experiences with sulfite.
All right, Tom.
Okay, so I'm Tom Oliver. I'm from a village in Herefordshire in England called Oakle Pitchard, and we make cider on a farm. So I describe myself as a farmhouse cider maker. I've done it in an instinctive manner from the word go. I have an appalling lack of science, maybe a half-decent palate. But we are, I reckon, blessed with, for me, some of the best fruit for making cider in the way that I grew up understanding what cider making was about. Big tannic cider apples and tannic perry pears. And we started selling cider actually 25 years ago this year, and I've sort of never looked back. I'm still trying to make good cider, and for me it's pretty much all down to the fruit. That's it.
Perfect. All right, now you know all of them. We know who you are. Cider makers mostly of the 5 to 10 year tenure. So that's good. It means you probably have been using SO2, and we're going to do some polls to see just how much you've been using. But first we should talk about what SO2 is. And Dave, I got to pick on you because you brought it up at one point to give us some context of how did SO2 come to be used in winemaking when, maybe give us a little context of it used in wine cider making versus other food processing industries.
Yeah. Well, I do like talking about SO2, and I think there's pros and cons. And, one thing about SO2 is, that it has been used for a very long time My impression is that the Romans were the first people to start using sulfites, and they would do this by burning sulfur, just like raw sulfur, which you can mine out of the ground, and then they would burn that to keep their barrels fresh. And so it was like a barrel treatment type thing in the Roman wine industry. And then we fast forward a couple thousand years, and one thing as being a food scientist, I had a lot of education about just the general food industry, and it may surprise a lot of people, but sulfur dioxide is used a lot in food, and in fact in foods you probably don't think about. So some of the most common examples would be like apricots for sure.
Dried fruit, yeah.
Dried fruit, especially golden raisins. The reason they're golden is because of SO2. Another thing would be French fries. French fries have a lot of SO2, and in fact, like orders of magnitude more than what we use in the wine industry. So I think it's important to think about, to give some context here, that we as an industry, whether it's wine or cider or both, we are not using massive amounts of SO2. We are not all just using SO2 like crazy. In fact, most winemakers are using pretty small amounts of SO2 compared to other food industries. Now, within the wine world, there's a lot of variation of low to high, but even on the high side of things, like the most SO2 you could possibly put into a cider until you get that SO2 off flavor is still much lower than what is used for apricots or other things. So I think that's like an important thing to just put out into space, is that we've been using SO2 a long time, it works well, and in fact in the wine industry we don't use a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's some good context, and we can talk a little bit about health and safety, because just because it's not dangerous maybe at wine concentration, handling it and using it can also still be dangerous. Not necessarily. Well, you should have caution. A little bit of context on use levels. TTB limit is 350 parts per million total. So that's the total amount of SO2 that you can add to your wine. Let's talk health and safety. Tom, you kind of brought it up when we were chatting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
My favorite topic. And the other thing that came up was that you need to be aware in terms of the legislation of sulfur. And for instance, 350 parts per million tops in the US, 200 parts per million in the UK. I mean, to me, a massive difference. And that may affect how you think about making cider if you maybe think that you want to put it into a different market. It doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that I'm ramping up my SO2 levels for my American export stuff. All right.
I think it also is good to point out here too is that even these levels that we're talking about, I don't know anyone that would ever use that ever. I mean, that's it's just so for any new people in here, 250 parts per million is total. I mean, that's
way
like
too much.
Crazy pants. That's crazy pants. Way too high.
You'd be able to taste it, and it would also probably mask a lot of really positive flavors. So don't take that as a guideline.
Let's run with that for a little bit. Tasting it. So obviously we're adding it to our ciders. It is a flaw that's recognized in cider making, American cider making, certainly. From y'all's experience, where do you start to see that as a flaw in terms of parts per million?
Cut off?
Well, I always understood that about 30 parts per million it became detectable by the average human.
Detectable.
Free?
Yeah.
Or free
total?
SO2?
Yeah, so 30 free. I've heard about 40. Obviously, I think it depends on a number of different
Individual
attributes
sensitivity plays a part as well.
Yeah.
For certain.
And I think that's something I had mentioned to you earlier is that I would strongly recommend that if you aren't familiar with what a SO2 or sulfite off flavor is, I would recommend doing some benchtop trials, especially with your cellar crew people, just in case somebody gets a decimal point wrong and adds way too much to a tank. Everyone in the cellar should know that, like, that's an SO2 thing, not wondering, like,
where'd that come from?
Yeah. And another good thing about doing it in a group is that different people have different sensitivity
Right.
levels, and maybe you aren't really aware of what it is or aren't familiar enough with it, or maybe you're just nose blind to it. And so doing it with a group of people is very helpful. And you can easily set up that, get some of your favorite cider, do some dosings, let them sit for a while, even overnight, and do a big enough range so that you will certainly find at where that sulfite character is starting to come out. And I think a lot of people get it as like fresh struck match, or like a chemical burn on your soft palate. I don't know, things like that.
Yeah, no, I feel it, I smell it, and part of the thing with getting nose blind to it, I think, is there are actually a lot of ciders on the market right now that at least I'm able to perceive the SO2 on the nose and on the palate, and so people might just associate that as a normal cider characteristic by this point. And so I do think this bench trial is a great idea.
I agree.
Yeah, so as we jump into already detecting it, let's back up a little bit and talk about how we add it, right? We generally add it as potassium metabisulfite, so a salt that's attached to the SO2 molecule. When we add it, we know that some of it becomes bound to compounds that are created by the yeast, usually acetaldehyde, can also bind to sugars, polysaccharides. So when you add and you calculate your addition, you don't always get what you intend. And can you speak to that a little bit on what you can expect when you make an addition?
Any of you guys want to take that one on, or?
I think you're much better at that. aspect, right?
We are. I will be honest. We are still trying to really nail that down. But one thing is because it will change. It will always change because every batch is different, and so one batch, if you have a little bit more acetaldehyde production for whatever reason, that's going to suck up and bind with SO2. So you will definitely see, at least if you add like 50 ppm, you could see 25 ppm free SO2. You could also see like 5 or 1 ppm free
It's
SO2.
also, I would say it's important to mention that takes time. And so you want to wait 24, 48 hours before you're testing your free SO2 to see what effect your dose had and how much is left after some amount has been bound.
Yeah, and it depends too if there's already SO2 in the system where you put it in and it's bound up with things. Then when you come back the next time and add in, maybe all of what you add the second time around becomes free because everything that can bind to the SO2 has at that point, and then you start actually getting significant levels of free SO2 the more you add. So it's definitely different every time.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and when we're talking about free SO2, typically we're at least thinking about our molecular SO2 concentration. So, I think wine science has established that as 0.8 parts per million. Some people approach their bottling protocol as like, hey, I got to hit that point before I pass go and go to bottling. One big problem with cider, though, is it's not exactly like wine. There's characteristics of it that differ, obviously. Tom, especially from the types of apples you use, could you speak to some of those differences, those natural protective features?
Yes, so I think we're referring to tannins and we're referring to the phenolics, and I'll stop there in terms of breaking down what those are and what they're called. But they do have this wonderful antimicrobial and antioxidative properties, which I have always understood that is what they offered cider. And so I'm going to say that when we started making cider, and still to this day, I look at there really is no need in a well-balanced cider with good acidity, decent alcohol levels, and good tannic cider fruit. It has self-keeping properties, and so I'm starting from that basic point, and so I see no need for sulfur up to a certain point.
Okay.
We had an English cider in our lab, and I opened it, and we tried this dry English cider, and had half the bottle. put like the cap loosely back on and put it in the refrigerator. And then a month later, I was like, oh, I need an English cider example. Oh, I have that half empty one in the fridge, and we took it out. I think it got better.
Yeah.
It was great, and I think it's just chock full of tannins. Those tannins are antioxidants, and they definitely will help keep the cider protected for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that speaks to, the SO2 really has two purposes. It's antioxidant and antimicrobial. So it literally is inhibiting, or in some case killing, bacteria and some of the, some native yeasts, as well as antioxidant. It doesn't directly bind oxygen, but it binds hydrogen peroxide, which is one of the downstream effects of oxidation. So speaking to its purpose in that relation, how are you all using it in your cellars? When, how much, at what points?
Should we just go down the line?
Yeah, let's
here?
just go down the line.
Okay. So we have an SO2 addition at juice arrival. So when we get like a tanker of fresh pressed juice and it comes to our facility, we'll hit it with 25 ppm free SO2. We used to use 50 ppm free SO2, but because of canning, now we are trying to reduce the amount of SO2 that we use overall. So we felt like that was an acceptable kind of like risk to have less O2 at juice arrival. We rarely have problems with spoilage, bacteria, or wild yeast, because our juice comes at like 36 degrees. And so there's not a lot of activity going on. And as a in between, like if in a perfect world, we'd probably add 50, but we are trying to reduce our SO2, so we're doing 25 ppm. How much does that do? Well, it makes me feel better, so I think that's like one big great thing. And I feel like it gives us a little bit of safety when it comes to the warming up period before the Saccharomyces take off. We have seen a couple times over the years, it was something that I did not believe could happen, but we did, during warm periods, we would see a juice tanker where it's supposed to have, 5 grams per liter titratable acidity, but instead it has like 2.5. And I was like, what is going on? And it turns out we were having malolactic fermentations take off before alcoholic fermentation. And that was because of a contamination at the presser and in warm conditions. And, that was a rarity. It only happened like once or twice in our 12 years, but it can happen. And so, when we look at how do we use SO2 at juice arrival, 25 ppm we feel like is a nice little add to give us some safety. And then after fermentation, when we do our blend backs and getting ready to go through crossflow, we will add another approximately 25 ppm of SO2 and do any tweaks we want to hit to get to our free SO2 level for our canned products, which is our target is around 10 ppm. 10 ppm. Now, is that really doing that much? Not really, maybe, depending on the literature, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, some literature says you need to be at 15 parts before you see any actual inhibition.
So we're towing the line, and in when we go into bottle product, we're more at like 17 to 20 ppm free, and we pasteurize all of our ciders, so it's not really microbial spoilage we're worried about. That might be different for other people depending on what you're doing in your packaging. Our products are pasteurized, so I'm not worried about microbial spoilage. What I'm worried about is antioxidant protection, and if I could, I would put more SO2 to make the ciders be preserved and the aromas fresher. But we can't because we're mostly all in can packages, right? And that's probably the next phase of our conversation. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. We'll definitely get into that. So we'll save it. Tegan, a little background on how you've used it, and how about winemaking context also would be great.
Oh, sure. Okay. So going back to the beginning, my traditional winemaking beginnings, we used quite a bit of sulfite at many stages of the process. We were adding it at pressing in order to tamp down any microbes that might have been in there. Again, to give the Saccharomyces cerevisiae its best shot at taking hold. We were adding it again post-fermentation at the initial rack. We were adding it again prior to aging, and we were adding it again prior to packaging, often in rather large quantities. I'm talking 50, 100 ppm, looking to have about 40 or 50 free. It was quite a bit. After that, we moved on to Eden, and at Eden, we started to use less sulfite. For one thing, we didn't really touch on this, but in wine, you can use a lot more before you taste it. In cider, especially with more modern apple varieties, not these wonderful tannic ones, you need some to protect them. Muhowever, you can taste it. So we were using a lot less. We were sulfiting the juice we were freezing for ice cider, but we were not sulfiting the juice that we were using to ferment right away. We decided to take the risk that other things could be growing in there. And honestly, I find sometimes there's a benefit to letting those apical yeasts have a little bit of a shot to create some aromatic complexity. Actually just came from a talk on aromatic ciders, and they do that a lot in France apparently, and it's pretty cool. So we did that, and we found we weren't having any spoilage problems, so we continued not to add sulfite to the juice, but we were adding it post-fermentation. I want to say we used about 50 ppm. We were not canning at this point, it was bottles. And we were adding it for aging. We were looking to have, I would say, between 30 and 50 free to make sure we weren't dealing with spoilage, we weren't dealing with oxidation during the time the cider was waiting prior to packaging. A lot of the ciders there, we were processing them in the fall, letting them age up until it's spring or summer prior to bottling them, sometimes a year, and then adding fresh product the following season. So, yeah, I would say that was basically the Eden method. It may have changed since then.
Can I ask, so I'm going to ask here, when you were adding the sulfites for the ice juice,
yeah,
what was the intention or the reason? Was it color, microbial spoilage, or flavor production?
I think in large part, yeah, it was for an antioxidant character, and also it's not always as cold as you want it to be in Vermont. When you're pressing these apples, we'd be pressing them oftentimes in December. They'd be held in cold storage prior to that, and you want the juice to freeze. That's the idea when you're making ice cider. You're pressing the apples, you're putting the juice outside, letting it naturally freeze, bringing it inside, melting it slowly. What melts first is the highest sugar content juice. That's what you're fermenting to make your ice cider. You arrest it partway through, so you've got high sugar, high alcohol. That's ice cider. Yeah, so that was actually directive that we had, was not to have that oxidative character even in the juice going into fermentation, and there was some concern about spoilage because it wasn't necessarily freezing as quickly as we wanted it to, so it was just sitting out there unprotected. When we moved to Sweden and started making ice cider there, we no longer felt the need to sulfite the juice because it was colder and it was freezing significantly faster. Umeå, for those who don't know, is like 2/3 of the way up Sweden. It's a pretty long country, think like California. So it was pretty chilly. And again, we'd be pressing the apples pretty late in the season. So we did not add sulfite to the juice because we just didn't feel like there was a need. And based on doing it, we felt comfortable doing it the next year because it went well the first time. We started using larger additions of SO2 less frequently. At Brenland, we found that it seemed like you could get away with using less overall if we were adding larger amounts at a time, just based on our own experimentation, based on adding it, taking readings, letting it sit, reading it again. And that seemed to be a pretty good way, but we were still using pretty high amounts, 50, 100 ppm range, free, trying to like protect our product. And we did also make sparkling products there. It wasn't just ice cider. We had a higher ABV cider, and we had a more of like a New World modern style cider as well. Once we got to Lost Boy, our founder Tristan is very conscious about everything that he puts in his body. And so one of the directives we were given was to try to minimize the amount of additives that we were using at any step of the process. And sulfite's really the only thing we add other than yeast and yeast nutrient. And then we also started canning. And like Dave said, there's a big concern with sulfite interacting with the can and producing H2S. Even though they're liners, there's been a lot of research and experimentation done, and it's not foolproof yet. We used research we got from Woodchuck and Cornell to determine that we wanted to go real small, and we were just doing 10 ppm, period. We are not adding it to the juice. We are not adding sulfite post-fermentation. We are only adding sulfite right before packaging, and I'll get into later some of the things we do instead of that and the reasons we feel like we can get away with it. So for canning, 10 ppm. For bottling, we're adding 30 ppm at the time of bottling. And for aging, we're adding about 50, testing again, and we're looking to have between 30 and 40 free for bulk aging for some of like our cellar series that are actually in a warehouse for a period of time. Yeah, I think that kind of covers the amounts at different places and kind of our evolution from quite a bit in wine to less at Eden and Brenland, and even less now at Lost Boy.
Perfect. Tom.
Okay, so we tend not to use any sulfur till really packaging time. It's a one-shot job. A lot of it depends on how it's been packaged, of course. Cans, we have to get contract packed, and they request, they say 10 to 20 parts per million free. They ideally want 15, but that's what the specifications from them is. For bottled contract packed, they request 20 to 30, and we oblige with that. When we're packaging, we mostly don't use any sulfur, but I would like to say that a typical Oliver's bottle conditioned cider from Herefordshire, when Westons do an analysis on it, and they do it because they have good laboratory staff and equipment, they typically get somewhere between 12 and 15 parts per million sulfur on something that's never been anywhere near any sulfur. And that's purely, I would suggest, maybe yeast generated. So the idea that a cider is sulfur free is just not possible in my mind. Every cider's got sulfur in it. It's just maybe come from a different place. For kegs and bag in box, it depends. If it's going to be out and consumed quickly, there is no need. We tend to look at things that if we think it might be on a shelf or not used for 6 months or more, then we would look again for somewhere between 20 and 30 parts per million of sulfur. The only time we look at sulfur at any time before that is we do have a rodent problem. It is a farm. What can you expect? But the rodent problem I'm thinking about is mouse, a particularly disagreeable taint, very memorable for those that are susceptible to it. I sort of know now when the peri-pairs are coming in, I sort of know who the culprits are, and we damp that down with a very small amount of SO2, something like a total of 15 or something, just so that we don't end up with peri with mouse taint, which doesn't sell well.
Do you use SO2 in barrels at all, like to preserve barrels?
In barrel situation, I'm not actually allowed to say this, but I
don't want you to incriminate yourself.
Yeah, the legislation in the UK does not allow us to actually put SO2 in barrels to preserve the barrel. It's not allowed. It can only be used as a preservative for food. So the way I get around it is I use the SO2 in the water in the barrel to keep the water fresh in the barrel to keep the barrel moist. So it's you've just got to be careful to explain to your local trading standards environmental health. And I will say one of the reasons that I actually started using SO2 was that my trading standards environmental health inspector, which is the local government body that deals with us, he said to me, I understand how your ciders keep well in terms of the bottle conditioned ones and in terms of the CO2 in the liquid and in the headspace, and I understand for things that are going to be drunk quickly. But I will tell you that I expect anything that you think might be on the shelf for over 6 months to have some SO2 in it if you're guaranteeing the product to have a shelf life. So that was an absolute strict warning. That's what the expectation from them was. So up until that point, I hadn't really considered using SO2, but that I had to think again because he represents government, and government can be intrusive.
Let's jump into reducing SO2 because I think that's part of why people are here. Dave, I think you were a part of a study that involved reducing SO2 in cans.
We're going to be doing that study soon.
Okay, got you.
So, maybe what might help would be just a quick background on
For sure.
on cider in cans.
Yes.
And then we can talk about why we need to reduce and everything. So I'm going to try to do my best to give a really quick summary of how we got to where we are when it comes to cans. This is my understanding of the situation. That's just that may not be exactly correct, but a few years ago, the state of California, they put some legislation out that said if you have BPA in your products, it has to be disclosed. That got interpreted to mean that California enacted a ban on BPA. I bet most of the people in this room have heard that California banned BPA, and that's not correct, I believe. I believe it is just that you have to disclose that it might be in your packaging. Because of that, the can manufacturers decided to switch the lining. For those of you who don't know, in an aluminum can, there's a plastic liner that's just a couple microns thin that they spray in there, so it prevents your liquid from actually touching raw aluminum. So there is a plastic liner in every can, and previously what they had been using for many, many, many years for green beans or what have you is just a BPA liner. And that is epoxy based. It seemed to work okay. When California quote unquote banned BPA, the can manufacturers we got to have a substitute. They came out with BPANI, which is BPA not intentional or not included. They're not guaranteeing it doesn't have BPA, but they're saying we're not intentionally adding BPA to the liner.
Like no sulfite added.
Right. And so that BPANI liner, the first generation liner, was, I think, acrylic based or some polyester based. It wasn't epoxy based, it was something else. Turns out it didn't work very well at all, really, for things that had low pH, high acid, or most importantly, SO2. So it worked okay for most beer, but they didn't try it with canned wine or cider or anything like that. And it became problematic where everyone was suddenly getting H2S off flavors, and that's theorized that it's because the SO2 is migrating through that plastic barrier, and when sulfites meet aluminum, you get a reaction, you get H2S, you get that rotten egg smell. And so the canning companies quickly came out with a BPA Generation 2, which is a modified epoxy, which I think there's it's the general consensus, I think, is that it works pretty well, maybe not quite as good as BPA, but I'm not sure how many really studies have been done on that. And so that's where we are now, is that we've got these cans that have this liner, and if you put too much SO2 in your product in a can package, you probably will get H2S sometime down the line. Thus why we've been trying to reduce our sulfur use and find alternatives.
Comprehensive.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Who here cans their ciders? Who here has had a cider that has had the type of flaw that Dave's describing? And you would probably say maybe it's from SO2 interacting with the liner. Okay, cool. So it's a problem we're all dealing with. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. Since that was Prop 65 that went through California. Since that went through, there's been numerous issues in our industry, some very large-scale issues, which has prompted this reduction of SO2 use or trying to eliminate altogether. Let's chat a little bit about what you do in terms of practices or maybe additions you're making in an alternative to SO2 that help protect your ciders. And feel free to elaborate maybe on how that fits into your larger stability. And maybe this is becoming a long question, but how does that fit into your larger stability piece? Tegan?
Oh, I'm going first.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a slightly different model at Lost Boy than we did at Eden or Brenland, in that we're producing cider year-round. We're using apples that are in cold storage as opposed to only once or twice a year in the case of ice cider. So for one thing, we are not keeping cider around as long in general. So there's just less opportunity to have issues with oxidation or microbial contamination or growth. We're going from juice in to packaging in as little as, I would say, 60 days, maybe even a little bit less in a lot of cases. Other ways that we are able to reduce sulfite use, step one is to be super duper clean. I mean, sanitize the crap out of everything before and after every use. Have someone else look over your work, make sure there's nothing you missed. So that reduces the chance of contamination of any kind. We also really try to minimize oxygen contact every step of the way. We're not so worried about it with juice, but after the cider's fermented, we don't rack it very many times. We don't actually filter at the moment. So we're racking it off of primary. We have one big tank we do most of the fermenting in, so we're racking it once into a second vessel where we'll do a secondary fermentation if we're adding a fruit or a vegetable or anything like that to add flavor. And then from there, we're racking it straight into the bright tank where we're carbonating it, or into bottle if we're bottling it. And then from there it goes into cans or kegs. So it's a pretty quick process. And when we are transferring cider, we are purging all of our tanks with carbon dioxide right now. If someday we had a nitrogen generator, we would use nitrogen instead. There's no reason we have to use CO2 except that we have it. And we are also racking our ciders over our carbstone. So we're basically putting our carbstone in a tube in line with the transfer of the cider, and we're running CO2 while we're moving the cider across it, and it's bumping out, theoretically, any oxygen that may be in there, and putting CO2 in its place. When we are canning, our canning line, we have a mobile canning line that comes in as well. We use Ironheart canning, and periodically they do check the DO, the dissolved oxygen levels, and ours are ridiculously low. We're looking at under 50 parts per billion. So I feel like what we're doing is probably working pretty well, so I don't have huge concerns over oxidation at the moment. Microbial spoilage is a little more of a concern because we are not filtering and we are not pasteurizing. Unfortunately, we do not have access to that, and it's a decision we've made that we are willing to take those risks, and knock on wood, we've been very fortunate so far. We've only lost one 1,000-gallon batch, and out of 50 to 60,000 gallons a year over 3 years, that's really not bad numbers. But there is a risk when you're not doing a lot to protect your product. And we have considered adding other options to the table. We would consider doing filtration. I don't know if anyone got to go to the talk on using, what's it called? Chitosan or Hideki tannin or something to deal with the issues of microbial spoilage and oxidation. That's not something we've explored yet, but it's something we could look into in the future.
Is anybody here using sacrificial tannins or chitosan or lysozyme or anything like that? Yeah, so basically, I guess to speak on that, Dave, are you using any of those?
No, we are looking at some antioxidant tannins.
Yeah, so gallic acid or something like that. Something.
Yeah, or like hideki.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It's on our to-do list.
Yeah, so the idea here is if SO2 is antimicrobial and antioxidant, you have to replace those two properties. You can't just pull your SO2 out and not replace it with something. So your hideki tannins are the antioxidant. Your chitosan is your antibacterial, antimicrobial. So that's very general. I'm sure whoever covered it in the talk, that was an hour long.
Did a great job, yeah.
Killed it, but that's kind of as far as we'll
But I
go
know
with
you have a different opinion on adding those things. I don't know if you want to speak to that, like philosophically.
Oh,
Yes, please do.
I think that my approach, it does stem. It is from the fruit. I keep going back to that, and it's probably a bit boring for those of you that only get to work with non-tannic fruit, because I think you have a much more of a struggle ahead of you than I have. I have a fantastic sort of cushion in the way that you can make cider. Our place, as I know certainly Dave can testify to, is not exactly your classic cider making setup. It is a farm. It's in barns. It's in repurposed sheds. And so there's a lot of microbial activity, both in the shed and in the cider. The thing to me is it good? I mean, does it enhance the flavor of the taste of the cider? And are you, when you're drinking the cider that we make, are you getting anything that's just giving you cause for concern? And, historically, the answer, for the most part, is no. Peter Mitchell, bless him, he's been always over the years, he said, look, it's working for now, but be prepared for it at some stage in the future not to work. And I'm still hedging my bets at 25 years. So I think this fruit does allow us to work in a particular way, if that's sort of answering. So it allows me to avoid the question of, do I have to use any of these other things? And I'll go I'm all about minimum intervention. A minimum intervention, there's a couple of things. One is if there's don't do something unless you really, really need to do it. And typically, our cider will, from when it's pressed, go into whatever it's going to ferment in. It will come out when it's racked. And the next time it will come out is when it's going in to be blended to make the cider that it will. We just keep it the amount of movements to the absolute limit, minimum. It's so sensible. And the other aspect of minimum intervention that I believe in is don't keep opening things up. Don't keep it unless you really, really have to. Because what are you doing every time you open something up? And typically, just to make you all aghast at how our approach is. Well, once the airlocks are fitted to the fermenting juice and the wild ferments have stopped spewing out stuff through the airlock, and we can replace it and it stays clean, we won't take those airlocks off again until after lambing, which will be April of the next year. All right. So I leave and this is every container. We leave them from October, November, right through to April before we get. There's no need to fiddle. Everything's going to work out all right. It has done historically. It does do every time, and it renders everything. There's no need to fiddle. I mean, it may seem fairly extreme, but that's the nature of farmhouse cider, I think.
I think there's something to be said about legacy, working with legacy orchards, and maybe being a legacy cider maker. Is you've had years and years and years of experience, so you know what to expect. So yeast creates SO2. It's part of its defense mechanism as it's going through lag phase against other microbes. So some strains create quite a bit, on the order of 30 parts, maybe more.
The Lallemand website for champagne yeast, TC1118, it says right there, may produce up to 30 ppm SO2. on the label.
So that's like the biggest struggle with taking contained sulfites off, is because so much of your yeast many yeasts are creating at least 10 parts per million. Are any of you working towards reducing sulfites because of consumer perception?
Yeah, I would say so, and even ownership perception.
Yeah.
There's concern there over additives.
Are people kind of demanding that you lower your SO2?
No, because I think still quality and consistency are primary, since we are a business and we want to ensure that what we're putting on the shelf, especially things that might be there 6 months to a year, are going to remain as intended for that amount of time, so that our customers are receiving what we wanted them to receive. And that is tantamount, but that's also why we're investigating other alternatives, because if we can get away with less sulfite, then we're pleasing people, even though, as Dave said, the science doesn't necessarily back up some people's sensitivities to it.
Yeah, the science, I think, is, I've read before, it's 1% of people that report SO2 sensitivities. It's only 1% that actually are sensitive or have a reaction to it. The consumer dollars are ultimately going to drive some production decisions at times, so we try to minimize that. But it seems like there's kind of a convergence of a couple different reasons to reduce SO2. The last thing I wanted to hit on was spontaneous fermentation, feral yeast, wild yeast, whatever you want to call it. Of our group here, is anybody doing spontaneous fermentation? 2, 3. Okay, I'll get all 3. This will be good then. How does SO2 play into your protocols when you're doing spontaneous fermentation?
Our spontaneous fermentations are largely when we do our Cidre Boucher French Kieve cider. And funny enough, there was just a lecture earlier today about that exact thing, and they 100% were like, here is the apiculate yeast that's is the first thing that starts fermenting at cold temperatures. It's Hansenia valiensis, I think.
HV.
And they were like, and it's sensitive to sulfites. So, if you want those things going, you probably shouldn't be adding SO2. So we don't add SO2 to the juice when we do our spontaneous ferments, because that's the whole point, is we're trying to get those things to go. But I would say also, if you're trying to have a spontaneous ferment that isn't specifically a French cider, or you want a cleaner fermentation, well, you can add SO2 to a spontaneous ferment for sure. What you're doing, though, is knocking back the other things besides Saccharomyces. And so that really gets into, what is your intention? What are you trying to do? And are you using awesome English cider apples, or are you using dessert apples? It's all in context. And so there isn't, I think, a right or wrong, but it's just what are you trying to achieve? And making sure, like you said, if you are pulling SO2 out, how are you covering your basis for oxidation or microbial spoilage? And there's a million different ways, but each person is going to have a little different path to get there. Yeah. So spontaneous.
Yeah. I mean, we don't use any sulfur, obviously, prior to fermentation. I've always been told that it's very, very useful to knock out the apiculate yeast, as Dave was saying. But for me, the heart and soul of a good spicy tannic cider is what the apiculate yeast give you. There are some that will give you the wrong things in too big of quantities, but it's all, for me, it's all about letting them do whatever they're going to do, and hopefully whatever they do is in harmony with the drink you're trying to make. But yeah, the last thing I want to do is knock them out. I want them to have a good 2 or 3 weeks, a couple of % of alcohol to work to before the old Saccharomyces workhorse kicks in. It gives me some alcohol.
Yeah, I would say with our spontaneous ferments, not only are we not adding it to the juice, but we're often not adding it ever. We're going full natural, I suppose, and even into bottle conditioning. A lot of times, if we're making a pet nat, we're not sulfiting anything ever. We're putting it in the bottle before it's done fermenting and letting it finish there. And yeah, there's a risk. It could be a little bit funky. we taste it before we bottle it, and we're like, all right, we think this is on track. If it wasn't, we'd do something else with it. Let the cider tell you what it wants to do. One thing I did forget to mention is that all of our ciders are dry, and that's another reason we can get away with a lot less in the preservative area. We're not doing anything with residual sugar.
While SO2 is pretty effective on some native yeasts and also bacteria, it's not very effective on Saccharomyces. So you have to kind of pair different risk aversion tools in order to do that. So maybe you're using potassium sorbate, maybe you're using Velcorin, maybe you're pasteurizing, maybe you're using a combination of that or something else. You have to do something, especially with sugars, if you have residual sugar in your ciders. All right. With all that being said, is SO2 necessary, Dave?
I think it depends.
I agree. Tegan?
I would say sometimes. I would say, yeah, it depends on the type of cider you're trying to make and what your goals are.
Yeah, I think I could get away with not using it, but I do.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said when you're running a business and you're a cider maker, and that's the difference between having saleable cider or non-saleable cider. Yeah. It's the difference of having another year to make fruit or to make cider, or kind of having to call it quits. I think the message here is that it depends. I would say most new cider makers should start by using SO2. It's an easy tool. It is tried and true. It has a lot of historical prevalence in winemaking and cider making. It works. Once you know what you're doing, then I think it's time you can be comfortable enough to start paring it back if you feel comfortable with that.
If you would like to hear the Q&A from this panel discussion where they get a little bit further into it, they're going to be talking to Christine Walter of Bauman's Cider on how the heck Bauman's has been able to get 3 best in shows for 3 years in a row without using any SO2. You also hear about what happens if you do add SO2 to an oak barrel, what happens in terms of malolactic fermentation, and a couple more questions. That bonus audio will be up at the Cider Chat Patreon page, and it's not going to have any kind of firewall. You could go in there and listen to it. It'll be for free. However, I do ask that if you're getting some value from this podcast, well, kind of consider me like your bartender. You show up to the bar, or maybe your cider bar, and you're doing a lot of service to people, and you have an hour-long conversation with them, probably going to leave them a little tip. And that's a little bit what the podcast patrons do. Leave a tip for this here bartender who happens to be your cider MC. You could do that at the Cider Chat Patreon page by joining today. Just Google it, Cider Chat and Patreon. Once again, it's spelled Patreon. And with that, I leave you here. This is Rio Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Strange apples, bitter sharp, strange apples, juicy and ripe. Bop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dum, bop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dum. Who wants a Tannenbaum?
I want a Tannenbaum.
Who wants to pull them down?
I'm gonna pull them down. Hey, 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 apples,
bittersweet, strange apples, hanging high. Got them strange apples. Forget the pie. Strange apples, squeeze them tight. Got them strange apples, strange apples, strange apples. Make them pop. Pop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-dee-da, pop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-dee-da.
Who wants a Tannenbaum?
I want a Tannenbaum.
Who wants to pull them down?
I'm gonna pull them down. Hey, hey, hey. come and see. Plenty strange apples for you and me. Strange apples. Strange apples. Strange apples. Make them pop. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Pop, 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 pop.
Yeehaw!